Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone watching this video on how to create a cybersecurity risk assessment. And in this scenario, I, our team created a risk assessment for the country of New Zealand at a global summit where a cyber incident happened. Let's just go a little over the agenda for today. Um, this presentation will give a closer look into the risk assessment of New Zealand's current posture for their cybersecurity, the AAA controls, vulnerabilities, the risk response plans, and some challenges that they may face. Uh, Trying to implement these controls and also trying to assess where their weaknesses are, but also giving some of their strengths. So let's get right into it. This risk assessment chart gives a guide to how to score a risk based on the vulnerability and the likelihood or the impact, and also the score gives you a neat little breakdown of how to color code it from high, medium, low. So a lot of the risks that are high risk, high reward are going to be in that red category. So those are the ones where you have ransomware attacks or you have SQL injections or cross-site scripting where you completely lose functionality. And then you have a couple lower level ones like phishing where you might have a couple users that are affected by it, but they're still very dangerous. And this slide, it just continues on how the scoring is tallied up for the risk assessment and how different levels of risk will trigger different responses. So a low risk will have a routine response, while a very high risk will have a response that has a lot more of management and stakeholders, a lot of the higher echelon, the higher levels of the company or the government involved in these higher risk type of scenarios. So, as Team New Zealand, here are some of the challenges that we're facing currently. We're trying to accelerate the information security guidelines and standards, and also how to automate those standards and make them easily accessible to different parts of the government. We also need to work on satisfying the different federal requirements that are required by the federal government of New Zealand, and create a extensive list of countermeasures for those different vulnerabilities and incidents. So to continue on, a lot like the risk assessment chart, this matrix gives more detail into the types of risks that are associated with different incidents. And the first one being like the SQL injection, where we came up with the probability of one of these attacks taking place, the impact of the attack. It can be broken down into three things: performance, cost, and time. Some counters to help combat these types of attacks from happening, which in this case for SQL injections would mean to check any kind of input types or validate it whenever you're entering your personal information on a web form. And also, we came up with contingency plans to help alleviate the stress for coming up with a strategy to mitigate each threat or each risk in this case. And I mean, I'll go over one more: the social engineering for people. So people are susceptible to, man, that's a good word, social engineering, and the probabilities of this can be uh, and in this case high, and it can have a huge impact on your company or your government organization. And here are some countermeasures to help mitigate social engineering. Those would be antivirus or anti-spam software. And the best training is to, in my opinion, is to have or to hold training for awareness on what and how social engineering, how it can take shape in the form of social media or in friend invites or emails. There's loads of different uh, components to social engineering that sometimes might not meet the eye. This next slide goes over the AAA model for our best shot at international security for all of the Five Eyes countries and the global economic scenario. So the access control, authentication, and the authorization are all a part of the AAA model for international security. And access control really delves into making it more difficult for an adversary or for an attacker to access the network in a way that it can be segmented into different components. A really common one would be mandatory access control, which it describes who needs to know what. Another one that is popular on Windows is role-based. So you might be familiar with sysadmins or network admins or server admins, and where each administrator has a set of privileges and a set of rights, and they are encouraged, and I mean it's deterred in most deployments where you aren't allowed to log on to network devices with a sysadmin account, or you're not allowed to, or vice versa, you're not allowed to log on to system servers with a network admin account. So it's separation of duties, essentially. Authentication deals with MFA, or multi-factor authentication, making sure that the person that is signing in has some other form of proving who they are, and then authorization deals with access control lists, which is segmenting your LAN or your VLAN into different lists. So certain computers or certain servers will have specific pathways to other hosts, making it a lot more difficult for an attacker to pivot, and that word pivot's a good word, to take their access and elevate it to a root level account, or to make their access like a super user where they can take full control of your system once they're inside. So, I mean, in the scenario, the attacker was able to exfiltrate data, and an ACL would have been very important because they would only be able to access a limited amount of data based on where they were trying to, or where they entered the network from. So this slide, I'll just leave it up here for you to read. Common types of attack vectors are normally dealing with the operating system or the OS, software that may be malicious or downloaded from a third or fourth party vendor that does not have trusted certificates or a reputable database for you to pull their files from. And I mean, in this case, sometimes there are malicious actors that will inject code in that leads to a virus being put onto your personal computer or onto a government server or onto a government information system. So it's important to check those vendors. And then hardware attacks would be any kind of loss or theft. And then human attack vectors would include improper usage, installing unauthorized software, or social engineering. So these are some of the strengths that I believe were displayed during the scenario where we were notified at an early time in the morning that there was a data exfiltration. So the internal detection system, the IDS, or intrusion detection system, IDS, was able to pick up on data being exfiltrated at the summit. And I think that it was important that the communication was there at the summit, where each team was summoned really early and they were able to identify that there is an attack. And so far, there hasn't been any reports of physical theft, of physical assets like computers or switches or network devices, or any kind of hard copy information. Some of the weaknesses that I think that were identified were the authentication, identification, and crypto failures. Well, obviously, in the last slide, we went over that there was no physical evidence that the person that, or the group that exfiltrated the data at the Global Economic Summit was in the building. So it must have been an attack that was remotely administered. And in that case, the following the authentication, there's a failure where maybe multi-factor authentication wasn't implemented on the government devices, or the cryptographic failure where the passwords may have been stored in clear text, which makes it extremely fortunate for the attacker, and it's a path of least resistance. If the password is there on your server in plain text, then it's easy to take that password and take the username and log in. And then identification failures. There's no network access controls that identified devices that may have been not compliant, and maybe adopting a framework like OWASP or ESAPI to add enhancement to authentication or identification profiles. So when it comes to risk identification, it is important to follow these 4 steps to identify, assess, control, and record. That's important. And the table to the right gives a chart of how risk is sometimes identified. Risk can be tolerated, which is acceptance. Risk could be treated, which is mitigation. It could be terminated, which is also some form of mitigation. Or risk can be transferred, where you transfer it to a company that ensures that if an attack is to take place, that they will be either partially or wholly liable, depending on what type of coverages you elect for. Here I laid out some common risk identifications that projects may face. Companies also, governments especially. We'll go over the main ones, which is time and cost. I think that we all feel as if there's not enough time in the day sometimes, and there is more than likely going to be a schedule overrun that needs to be incorporated into a scope of work. That way, you're not rushing to put together or slam together a project that just leads to lots of mistakes being made, and things being overlooked. And it it gives you an opportunity to compress the schedule or to find leaner methods to uh, complete your project deliverables. And also, I'll touch on poor communication, not being able to uh, really portray or convey to your stakeholder or to the citizens that you're protecting what type of work that's being done and what the expectations are for that work. And they should always be updates should be positive and they should be timely. Um, and then also I said I would touch on cost. Cost, you want to make sure that you build in any kind of unanticipated costs. I mean, it's kind of hard to build in something that you don't know, but it's important to have that buffer in there. So going over the vulnerability matrix, this gives the current and emerging risks that our nation is facing right now. And again, our nation is the nation of New Zealand, and it gives you a good look at the vulnerability plus the threat and what kind of attack vectors are commonly used for these different types of attacks, and then also it gives some steps for mitigating these attacks. Attribution is important in creating a case for how the attack happened, who the attack is, and where it happened. So, and at this point, the location has not been identified for the attacker. And also, we would like to include who was the target, if you're a target, or if you're collateral damage in the attack. If you're a part of a large-scale attack, you might have just been a small piece of the puzzle that is a much greater puzzle. So in this case, it appears that the members at the summit were the target, and we are not collateral damage, and there has not yet been a suspect, a group, or an individual that has been identified for being responsible for this attack. The risk response plan deals with taking negative risks, or subtracting risk, or adding to a risk. So mitigating would be you're taking a risk that may all well be an operational risk. In this case, we'll say petty cash. So a company needs petty cash, and they want to eliminate the risk of people stealing money, so they remove the option to even take out petty cash, and they replace it with a corporate card. So that would be mitigating the risk. Accepting the risk would be a person or company takes that petty cash and they create a ledger, or they create something where you can accept the risk and also monitor the risk. Avoiding the risk would be, hey, if you have the petty cash, we're just going to not alter our risk management response to people or individuals taking that money and spending it elsewhere. So getting into the mitigation strategy for our country would look a lot like, if the probability of an impact is low, we can reduce the amount of weekly meetings to one. And that is in the case where it is very low. There's not a high chance of that risk coming to fruition and taking place. But if the attack has a higher risk, everyday meetings would be necessary to help avoid or mitigate. Or taking us back to the last slide, create a very compact and lean risk response plan for our nation. And so we have the risk mitigation plan. These are examples for you to take a look at. We have a server, and if the server is unavailable because there is a program on it or a application on it that cannot load, then a mitigation plan might look like periodically checking the status of the server to ensure that the program is loading. So mitigation can be tailored to a case by case situation. So that brings us to the risk mitigation chart, going over risks that are commonly associated with scope creep, not developing or executing on your scope of work. And I'll leave the rest here for you to take a look at. So lastly, our mission. Our group has been tasked with identifying, accepting, and mitigating risks based upon the threat and the analysis of the risks and vulnerabilities. We have also been tasked with prioritizing threats and vulnerabilities and creating an analysis on the likelihood of those threats taking place. Thank you for sitting through this presentation. If you would like to reach out to us, we can be contacted below with our contact information. And again, this is just a scenario, so none of these, the phone number's fake. But thank you, and I hope you learned something new today.